Welcome to everyone just joining us. We'll be getting started in 1 minute. Welcome to everyone joining. We'll just let people get into the session and get started in 30 seconds. Please feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. You can type in your name, organization, and country. And when you type in the chat, make sure to select all panelists and attendees so we can see you, everyone can see your message. Also a reminder, we'll be using the Q&A box, and make sure you add in any questions for our panelists in the Q&A box, which will be separate. And finally, there is interpretation available into French and Spanish, and you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. We'll now go ahead with the webinar. Welcome everyone. My name is James Ellsmoor. I'm the CEO of Island Innovation. I'll be your moderator today. Unfortunately, Vanessa Hartman, who was originally scheduled to moderate this panel, has been taken ill, and so she won't be able to join us. And so for the next hour and 15 minutes, I'll be walking through with the panelists on the session. This should be a very interesting session. Very excited to have this as our final wrap up of what's been a very exciting week with a lot of interesting topics. So this is going to be an overall summary, the way forward for sustainable financing in the Caribbean. And we've got 3 great speakers coming up. And then afterwards, there'll be a short closing ceremony where we'll go through a general wrap up of the week. So this panel will be about 1 hour long. And actually to start, I'm going to go straight into a video, which has been sent in by our first panelist, Danielle Carreira. And so we'll play this video and then she'll do a short introduction. And she's the head of finance sector for the Tropical Forest Alliance at the World Economic Forum. So we'll just go ahead and play the video firstly.
Now, we are putting enormous amounts of public money, yours and mine, money into the economy. And that is a good thing. We're doing that to regenerate the economy, to kickstart it. We're not going to put that money in the same old groove that breaks the planet. Scotland, they committed 250 million on peatland restoration over the next 10 years. Bravo for that, right? Laos has rolled out restoration of urban wetlands. Kenya has invested in deeply degraded lands around Mount Elgon with investments to restore those ecosystems. So it's not just a wealthy country story, it is a global story. What kind of tax breaks are we putting in place? What kind of incentives do we have today in terms of subsidies that drive a destructive environmental path? And can we flick that switch towards driving a nature positive path? And the answer is absolutely yes. It will come from the private sector too, because it will be the profitable and the right way and the long-term sustainable investments to do. Yes, we can get a great quarterly profit by cutting the proverbial forest empty or fishing the proverbial waters empty, but then what? So it is very much in the interest, long-term interest of business and therefore investors in these businesses to see that shift. when we make investments, have we thought about the footprint that these investments create on nature, on climate? It's a simple yes or no. And in most of the cases, the answer would be no, we haven't. Sure, do we know what our pension funds do? Are we sure that they are investing with the right kind of sustainability in mind?
Danielle, go ahead with your intervention.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here today. I have to say that I wish I was an in-person event right now in the Caribbean. I'm in London right now and it's very grey and wet. So for those who are not familiar with the Tropical Forest Alliance, or TFA, we are a multi-stakeholder partnership platform hosted by the World Economic Forum. And we currently have around 200 partners, including companies, governments, civil society, indigenous people, local communities, and international organizations who are all working together to advance the world's transition to deforestation-free commodity supply chains. And I think, as we've heard from Inga Anderson, it will take all of us to fix this serious problem that we are facing. It's not that we need to pay for nature, but we need to restore the nature that we have ourselves destroyed. Investment in nature-based solutions need to at least triple in real terms by 2030 and increase fourfold by 2050 if the world is to meet its climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation targets. And we need to share the responsibility, taking a holistic and collaborative approach. And what do I mean by shared responsibility? Literally, we all have a role to play. If we look at the private sector here, it is only financing 14% of nature-based solutions investment at this point. And surely this needs to change. Nature-based solutions can be attractive, for example, for the private sector, where it accesses new sources of revenue, increased resilience of commercial activities, reduces costs, and contributes to reputation and purpose, really, of a company. We have provided a few examples in this report. This video is linked at a report that we launched in May. And we have provided some examples on how the private sector is already supporting this transition. And one that comes to mind here is the development of a new business model in Zimbabwe, where via the payment of wildlife service, where farmers derive income from conserving wildlife through ecotourism and safari hunting. Here, users contribute financially to compensate for the maintenance of ecosystems. In the report, we recommended 5 actions to accelerate private sector finance for nature-based solutions: innovate, measure, decarbonize, transform, and scale. It doesn't have to be necessarily in this order. But another point, we need to do it collectively. And by collective, I really means with the involvement of all key stakeholders in the decision-making process. It's not easy, but it is required. And from a broader level, I think we also need to work together to create standard metrics, baselines, common characteristics for nature-based solutions to facilitate the creation of a new asset class, investable asset class. This has been identified as a major bottleneck to attract private sector investment to nature-based solutions. And that takes me to a third point, which is the need to adopt a holistic approach. Policies have largely tackled biodiversity loss and climate change independently of each other, rather than taking this holistic approach that is needed. As I have mentioned earlier, private sector is contributing just 14%. But when we look at private sector contribution to climate finance, it totals 56% of the total investment. Of course, we are now thankfully in a point in time that climate risks, climate transition are better understood and accepted, but climate and nature are part of the same system. Quick fixes for climate change risk harming nature. Therefore, climate solutions going forward need to take nature into consideration. The future is going to be low carbon, inevitably, and to get there, it will be disruptive and not linear. But if we do it quickly and smartly, we can avoid major disruptions and unwanted consequences of our actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle, for that that overview of the work, and we'll look forward to asking you questions as we go into the discussion for the second half of this session. I'd now like to welcome Karolin Troubetzkoy. If you'd like to come onto the screen, Karolin. Karolin is the chair of the CBF and also is representing the St. Lucia National Conservation Trust Fund. So Karolin, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, James. I wish I was the chair of the CBF, but I'm a director on the board of the CBF, and I'm the chairwoman of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund. It hasn't been pointed out here, but what is interesting for me is also my background as a hotel owner in the Caribbean in St. Lucia, and also the terms I have served as the president of the St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association, 4 terms. And I was only the second woman to serve as president of the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association. In St. Lucia, I was able to found the Tourism Enhancement Fund. So I'm excited in a way, because I think that when I look at our Congress today and where we have gone with conservation finance, I think we have come a long way. I think that we have identified the goals, we have our vision, we understand the challenges, we know that we need to do more in the Caribbean when it comes to education and really change the mindset and really make everyone from childhood on more aware of the importance of conservation. We also understand that when we have these panels is often our, I would say, the professionals, the passionate people that are already part of the conservation dialogue, sharing ideas, but we know that we need to bring civil society and other parts of the private sector to the table. Now, because of my background in tourism, I was asked recently to speak at a United Nations Development Program panel on the future of tourism, and I realized that a lot of what I presented there is really very, I would say, appropriate also to mention here. So really, for me, when I listen to so many fantastic ideas and when I am surrounded by so much knowledge and so much professional expertise, I know we have the aspiration, we have the vision, but how do we now move to implementation? And my first message was, don't reinvent the wheel, let's push it forward together. There is still quite a lot of duplication of effort. So if we find a way to streamline the initiatives, I think we will reach that light at the end of the tunnel much quicker. There is also a need to have some sort of umbrella tourism, and this is tourism related, but we can just leave the word tourism out and say we need an umbrella sustainability Caribbean information platform, so that we know what's happening, what's out there that we could take advantage of, and also share best practices, but also highlight the opportunities. I do feel there is a lot of duplication that could be avoided. Now, often we try to come up with ideas that say, oh, we need to have this entity and that, but we have a really good network in place already. We have our national conservation funds. As you know, there's 10 that have a partnership agreement with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. Imagine there were more of us. So I think this framework of the Conservation Fund makes a lot of sense. But we know that tourism plays such an important part in driving conservation finance forward. So I suggested that, we try to support the existing tourism entities, such as on the private sector side, the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, Caribbean Alliance for Sustainable Tourism, the Education Foundation, but also the Caribbean Tourism Organization, to drive the sustainability agenda forward. And they have come out of the 2017 storms, out of the pandemic with reduced capacity. So they also need grants to be able to develop sustainability programs at National Hotel Association levels. And the Caribbean Alliance of Sustainable Tourism can certainly play an important part in this. The CTO does have a sustainability conference, but I think this is only biannual, and I think it's something that needs to be supported and broadened, so that we have a regional event that would also help us to compare notes and drive the agenda forward. When it comes to education, I already spoke of the importance starting in childhood, but also on a hospitality side, or generally, when we look at companies, we need to have sustainability training and certification tools. You want a lot more people really understanding what means building of resilience, what means mitigation of the effect of climate change, what means conservation. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. I'm always surprised when I highlight in St. Lucia that I'm the chairwoman of the National Conservation Fund, that many people still are not really certain what is the role of this conservation fund. So even at home, we still have some work to do. One of the areas, the challenges that I've highlighted in many presentations, is that we need to find a consistent national public sector entity that drives the sustainable tourism agenda, or the sustainable agenda forward. I say this because often we are hindered by the 4 or 5 year election cycle, and that often we end up with completely new persons to deal with, completely new structures of ministries, and that should be altered, because it does stop our moving forward together. Funnily enough, at the last United Nations Development Panel, all 3 presenters came up with that same thing, that same idea, and so I think it has some resonance. On the tourism side, again, you need to really put all the players together, whether it's conservation fund, tourism board, tourism hotel associations, to see how we can move forward together, and what should be the future of what I would call a more responsible tourism product, and also catering to what we think will be the new responsible traveler. And I mean, again, I love the fact that we heard from Voyage, Nelly, about the opportunities that come out there, where a traveler can actually book a holiday, but also make offset the carbon footprint with a donation. We need a matchmaking platform. I think that what we realized coming out of the pandemic, it's not just the public sector that needs funding, also private sector needs support if we are supposed to drive a responsible tourism or a sustainability agenda forward. So I thought if there was a matchmaking platform where you can match projects in need of funding with funding opportunities, that would be great. I look back at an opportunity. The Clinton Foundation, after the 2017 hurricanes, had events in the Caribbean, and I love the fact how they always try to present projects and then also match it with a donor agency. We certainly, and I love what Justin Ram presented during the conference. Our capital markets are still very traditional in the Caribbean, so we need to find more innovative funding mechanisms. And I want to just say that there's opportunity for debt conversion, green resilience bonds, but also blue resilience bonds. So there is opportunity that needs to be further explored. I think that, again, many agencies that have funding for the Caribbean are not sure how to disperse it, but that's why I think you need to make use of the national conservation funds and also the tourism enhancement funds that are out there. And for the national conservation funds, I think there's an opportunity to be more proactive in identifying what the projects are that can be realized. And I really think that we need to start by identifying the low-hanging fruit. I cannot speak highly enough of many people in St. Lucia or elsewhere in the Caribbean. I've been on so many amazing panels, but usually the subject matter becomes so complex. So the meetings are 3-4 hours long. And sometimes I feel if only we had just focused on identifying the low-hanging fruit and get that done, that would be great. I'm going to be in trouble with all my hotelier friends and the cruise industry, but I do feel that the time has come that we discuss a resilience fee. It doesn't have to be a lot, but man, there's over 30 million stayover visitors coming to the Caribbean, and the same amount, 30 million of cruise visitors when things are normal again. And I don't think anybody minds paying a small fee to help us get back on our feet and help us to get more resilient and less vulnerable. And then again, when we look at sustainable finance mechanism, I think there are opportunities to use some of the new innovative digital payment platforms that are out there. The OECS has a digital wallet initiative, and there's also a young entrepreneur that has come up with something in the Eastern Caribbean called Penny Pinch, which is a digital payment platform. That's my presentation. I feel I overstayed my welcome. I went as fast as I could. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karolin, for that great overview. And just a reminder to everyone that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. We can grill Karolin with all of our questions after that. So now I just invite Yabanex Batista, who's the CEO of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, to come up and give a quick overview, and then we'll all come back on screen for a discussion.
Thank you so much, James, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining today's session, and thank you so much, Danielle and Karolin, for your words. In fact, part of what I'm going to mention now to all of you in this opening statement is goes back, and it's related to the words from both Danielle and Karolin. Conservation finance, when you look really outside of our bubble, it's still very new, not only in the Caribbean, but really worldwide. And I think that's something that all of us that have attended this Congress this week need to keep in mind. We are entrenched in this field, but the rest of the world is not. And we need to make sure that we continue to spread out the word, that we continue to work with others. And I think that's the second point I wanted to highlight, which Danielle also brought up, that we have to work collectively to prioritize conservation finance in general. I think there is a fear out there to pay for the environment, not within our sector, conservation or sustainable development or climate change practitioners, but I think outside of that, in many other sectors, there is still this fear of realizing and acknowledging that we do have to pay for the environment and the services that it provides to all of us. And we need to continue to fight that fight. And I think in part, we are going to be successful in fighting that fight if we diversify. I think first, we have to stop thinking that environmental issues are going to be solved with grants. Grants are, yes, important, and grants are essential, but we need to think beyond grants. We're definitely not going to move the needle, as is sometimes said, with just grants. And this means the private sector engagement with, for example, the ideas that Karolin already mentioned. It talks to looking at when it's the right time to have blended finance and impact investment approaches, which was discussed in the last session before this session today. And I think in this whole process, we also need to think about not leaving behind the small NGOs and the community-based organizations. Particularly in small island developing states or large ocean states, it is the small NGOs and the community-based organizations that are probably best positioned to make change, both at the local level, but also at the national level. And I think they are a crucial variable in this conservation finance equation when we talk about islands. I think we also need to be creative. I often say that when you talk about conservation finance and building financial mechanisms, creativity is really the limiting factor. And I think we need to continue to move outside of the current boxes that we are in and think about new ways of investing in the environment and creating new financial mechanisms. I think the other thing, and that was mentioned by Danielle as well, that for me is also very important, is that just as we diversify in terms of financial instruments and financial flows, we need to diversify the partnerships. I think that it's already happening in many ways around the world, but we need to continue to push for that. If we just keep doing partnerships among conservation-focused organizations, we are not really gonna go too much forward, and that's what we really want to do. And last, I want to go back to the video that Danielle presented from from the report on the state of nature financing. And one thing that really strikes me about that report and the words that Danielle also brought to us today is that we need to really finish and go away from the silo thinking, even within our sectors, the ones that are related to environment and sustainable development. This Congress, and we are in the CBF, one of the organizing partners, this Congress is entitled Conservation Finance Congress, right? But we are really talking about conservation finance. We're talking about climate change finance. We're talking about sustainable development finance. We're talking about ways of financing sustainable livelihoods. So at the end, for me, I think what we really need to really start talking about, and going back again to the report, is we need to talk about nature finance. I think nature really brings us all together, all these subsectors that I've just mentioned. And it's really going to help us to move forward away from that silo thinking. I think that's also where the international community is going. That's where the international negotiations are going. For the longest time, there was this divide and chasm between biodiversity financing and climate finance. But I think everybody is realizing that we cannot keep those artificial divisions anymore. So thank you so much, James. Back to you.
Thank you, Yaba, for that overview. I'd like to invite Karolin and Danielle to come back on screen again. And I'm just looking down through the chat at the diversity of countries we have represented. I'm sure I'm going to miss one. This is a dangerous thing, but Dominica, Bahamas, Jamaica, Haiti, St. Lucia, of course. There's lots more here coming through. Saba. So it's Belize, Barbados. Okay, I won't go on, but feel free to, if I missed you, to type it in the chat. But I think that's just really important to see how this kind of virtual event can bring together so many different people. The Marshall Islands, someone just said, and that I think it illustrates it really well. We had the Seychelles earlier as well. So all of the main CIS regions have been represented, and many more. We haven't had any questions come in yet. I have some, so don't worry, but it would be great if people do have questions for the panel, then please go ahead and submit them. But given the overview that we just had from Yaba and Karolin, I think the first question that I have here, I'd be really interested to hear from you about the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture. And although you covered this during your talks, the first question that I had there is, so what do you think that's accomplished since it was created? Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Or the main accomplishments, I should say. Karolin?
Thank you, James. Well, I think that, you know, we cannot just take for granted that these conservation funds have popped up. It was hard work over a number of years to actually get to the point where we are. We have this framework now that is properly incorporated. And so I think that's a big accomplishment. And when I look at that framework that has been created, it really is perfect for not only receiving, but also then dispersing grants on a national level. So I think we've come a long way, and I'm also happy to say that the funds that were able to, and I'm sure the participants realize that the relationship with the CBF also is like that you have to do you have to do a one-by-one match to the grant making. So we also are, I mean, encouraged to go out there and find our own funds, and we have done this successfully. And I know it's still infantile moments for some of us, but we have been able in St. Lucia, for example, to already finance some projects, and I think we're on the right track. It just now needs to be multiplied. And so, but I think we've come a long way, and we should not underestimate the hard work that went into actually creating the framework.
Yaba, anything to add?
Yes, thank you, James. I would like to piggyback on some of Karolin's points and add a few things. When we look at the history of the architecture, we really we have to go back over 10 years ago. Some of you would remember that the idea for building the CBF together with the National Conservation Trust Funds that form this architecture goes back to the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, which included two main goals: protecting 20% of the nearshore ecosystems of those countries that are part of the CCI, and then building the sustainable finance mechanisms to support the countries in achieving this goal and keeping those actions into the future. And the CCI was launched in 2008. And some of this, I think, was also mentioned in the opening session of the Congress. But when you go back to 2008 and you ask how many conservation trust funds there were in the Caribbean, in 2008, if my memory doesn't betray me much, we had the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica. I think that was really a pioneer trust fund in the region. And then if we go to the wider SIDS throughout the region, we had already PACT in Belize. And that was pretty much it when you look at conservation trust funds throughout the region. And now, 13 years after that, Karolin already mentioned, we have this collective of conservation trust funds that are part of the regional architecture, with the regional partner being the CBF, and then these other 10 national conservation trust funds that have been created since 2008, collectively working together. And it was very hard, as Karolin said, this whole process, but I think it has really paid off. It has taken time, but that's also what it takes. We do have to play with the urgency of dealing with the importance of conservation finance, but also building these kinds of institutions the right way also takes time. And for me personally, it's really rewarding to see how this architecture now is truly changing the conservation finance landscape in the Caribbean. I recall that around 2015, we had, yes, a few more conservation trust funds at the national level being legally established. But at that time, there were still a lot of questions around it. It's like, how do you build a conservation trust fund? Who should be part of it? How do we even legally establish these funds? All those questions we still had to answer about 7 or 8 years ago. And there were a lot of concerns about how does the fundraising needs to happen. There were a lot of concerns, and Karolin mentioned about the fact that the CBF requires a match to the grants resources that we provide. There was a lot of concern about how are we going to get that match. In the Caribbean, we don't have resources. We cannot really fundraise from within the region. And I think now in 2021, I can really tell you that that was a myth. There are ways of building financial mechanisms within national context in the Caribbean, and we are seeing those in play already. Yes, maybe they are still small in some cases, as Karolin mentioned, but I think we are demonstrating collectively as Caribbean Conservation Trust Funds that we can do this. And I think that for me, for the last decade, that is the most important message that I would take from the buildup of the architecture. That it can be done. It doesn't mean that we don't require assistance and we don't require continued help from our partners, including development partners and NGOs and others, but we can do it.
Absolutely, and the CBF's really to be congratulated for achieving this over so many different nations and jurisdictions, because I think that is a real challenge the region has, is this division between a lot of small countries that maybe have certain limitations of resource, and the fact that you've been able to bring that regionally together is really fantastic. This week, we've had a lot of discussions of different mechanisms, different opportunities that are being explored. And Karolin mentioned low-hanging fruits, that we should really look at low-hanging fruits. And there are so many different potential opportunities. And maybe asking for the top one is too much, but I don't know if the top 2 or 3 that you think are either the low-hanging fruits or should be the priorities for conservation finance in the region moving forward. We'd like to take that one.
James, should I go first?
Absolutely.
I think that in my own the presentation I had given, I think that for me, the priority in a way is really that we need to get all the players together. And that is the players that are the decision makers. That's really important. But then we also need to find a way to engage and be more visible with the efforts and really get the private sector at the table, and so that they understand what it is we're trying to do. And then thirdly, I think that there needs to be still some work how to help these conservation funds to be more effective in the fundraising and grant monitoring. So I think that there is also an opportunity to help us to get further by having some support in how do we raise more funding, whilst at the same time, of course, we are trying to get the private sector involved and also come up with what I would say an ongoing sustainable mechanism like the resilience fee I mentioned, for example, right? But I think that there is many untapped opportunities and we need support still to tap into them.
I'm going to go to Danielle, and maybe you want to bring in some of that question, but there was also a specific question for you, Danielle, from Andrea Montero, asking that the report you talked about refers to public money as part of the solutions. Do you know of any case studies that are from developing or southern countries in which governments have adopted financial policies or the right financial policies?
So I'm not going to refer to a case on the report, but I think just to add to that what Yaba said, and I think what Karolin said as well, yes, I think the collaboration is not public sector responsibility. I think that's one thing that needs to be clear. At the moment, when you look at nature-based solutions, yes, most of the funding is coming from the public sector. We are in a situation now of reset. We had a pandemic. Government funding is difficult. So I think private sector needs to step up, and there needs to be a coordination between companies, between public sector, between private sector, between local stakeholders, as I have highlighted and Yaba has highlighted as well, and Karolin as well have. But answering this and one thing that I wanted to flag, that it concerns me a little bit, the reliance that we see, like from a, and I'm going to come from a global perspective here. We have been relying a lot on blended finance. Everyone is really excited about blended finance, which is needed. I'm not denying that blended finance and this funding coming from philanthropy and government and all of that is really important, because I think what we're trying to do here, when I think from the financial sector perspective, is risky. Yes, I've been working with institutional investors like pension funds and asset managers for nearly 15 years now, helping them to identify environmental risks and opportunities. And what we always hear is very risky. You know, we are investing money of the public, of workers, and we need to have the financial return. So I think this is something key that we need to address. If we want to scale, if we want the capital markets to be involved, we need to improve transparency. We need to improve standardization of all of that. So I think just to re-emphasize here that private sector needs to step up. If we go to the public sector, and I think one example that I am very close now at the moment, I am Brazilian. I've been living here in London for many years. And I'm working with several Brazilian banks, companies, producers, trying to create this bridge and create this dialogue to develop innovative finance for the production of cattle and soy in Brazil. And public sector have a huge role. And I'm going to come from a regulator perspective here, like the Brazilian Central Bank. Yes, Brazilian deforestation has been at the top of the, not the agenda, I wouldn't say, but everyone is very aware to know of what's happening in Brazil and in the Amazon and all of that. And it took some private sectors to really step up, to know, and to say we want to change that. And the way that the central bank, which is a regulator in Brazil, have acted is they issued 2 consultations now on climate risk and also on the rural credit policies. So I think there are examples where we are seeing, the public sector, the regulators, the policymakers stepping up and really trying to change the game. It's not easy, of course, but that is one example where we can see, from a developing economy, where we can see some public sector trying to adjust really the regulations and all to meet those needs, really.
Thanks, Danielle. And what we found often when engaging with some of the private banks is that some of it's language. There is an interest in the Caribbean region in engaging in these topics from the banking sector, but the words that are being used, even if maybe the goals are similar, are completely different. And so I do think it's a really exciting opportunity in this region to try and show the banks that there is an opportunity here. It's not just charity work, it's a finance opportunity as well.
Exactly, and I think this common language needs to be. That's why I think the dialogue, the collective action is needed. I think I'm just going to give an example again. Sorry to step up again, but I was having a really good conversation. We're talking about valuing nature and putting a price in nature and all of that, and how this has been not that well accepted by some, but really well accepted by others. But I was talking to a producer the other day, and he was saying, I have a huge area of conserved area in my farm, in my lands. When I go to a bank and I want to borrow some money, the area which is preserved, native vegetation, does not have any value as a collateral. So that is how we are thinking, we need to value nature, but at the top, we are actually not doing that as well. So I think there is a lot of change that are required, but I am quite positive. I think I have seen a lot of progress over the past 15 years that I've been working with the finance sector in that direction.
Maybe we can get some of those Brazilian banks in conversation with their colleagues in the Caribbean.
They are changing. Slowly they are changing.
Oh, fantastic. Yaba, there's a specific comment that I wanted to draw your attention to, and then I'm sure there's a lot of things to respond to that we've just discussed. But someone had commented that they're very happy to talk about this move away from grants and that it is necessary, but how is that done essentially? What is the mechanism for distributing funding outside the grant process? So maybe you can incorporate that into your comments.
Thank you, James. First, on the comments from Danielle now, I think on the engagement of the private sector, one of the things that we need to recognize within the conservation finance community is that often the private sector doesn't come into the picture because they feel insecure. It's not necessarily because they don't have the money. I think we all know that, but they do feel insecure. They feel insecure because they don't necessarily have the right policy environment. They also feel insecure because often, perhaps still in the conservation sector, they are seen as ATM machines that can just put money out, and they really want to be, those that are more progressive, they really want to be part of the building process. They want to be part of the design process of those financing solutions for nature. And I think we need to realize that. And that's in some ways a segue to the question that you just posed, James, from the audience. I don't think, and I'm reading it, I don't think it's really moving away from grants. I think we're going to need the grants no matter what in different contexts. But I think it goes back to my point earlier on diversifying. I think not only we need to diversify the kinds of flows of money, but we, for example, in conservation trust funds, we need to diversify the kinds of instruments that we employ for channeling the resources that we are able to mobilize into the field for on the ground and in the water projects. Let me give you an example. Again, going back to small NGOs and community-based organizations. Sorry, I have a little concert behind me. I think you can hear it. I'll try to be quick. The small NGOs or community-based organizations cannot handle large sums of money, but again, they can make big changes. I think we need to start working on microfinance, conservation trust funds. We need to get into microfinance within our region. I think those kinds of institutions can take us very far if we provide them with tools like microfinance so that they can do their work and implement their ideas. Blended finance, yes, it's not a silver bullet, but I think there are many instances in which we conservation trust funds in the Caribbean need to start thinking and putting forward approaches for blended finance. Earlier this week, the French government announced that the CBF is going to be receiving a grant from them to design and implement financial mechanisms both at the national and regional level. And one of the areas that we hope to explore with the French government support is, in fact, approaches for blended finance and impact investment regionally or throughout the region, at least. I think it's important that we often then use this grant money. I am a firm believer of this, that we use grant money to create those sustainable long-term financing mechanisms. I think that's one of the ways in which we can give a better use to grants, for example. So I think those are two ideas, James, that I would like to throw here into the conversation. There are some others, but in the interest of time, I'll stop here.
Thanks, Yaba. And I think one of my great experiences this week is how many dogs, animals, children we've of our speakers we've got to hear from during the panel. So no, that's great. There's a couple of questions that came in. I'm going to try and group them together about networking and information, which is obviously a big part of the CBF's role. Michelle Bell had asked the idea of an umbrella information platform with highlighting those resources and success stories and lessons, which organization is best positioned to execute that kind of information. Anne Harding had asked, there were many great action points raised over the last 3 days. How is that momentum that's been built? Like, how do we keep that up, and what are the outcomes of that? So there's some crossover with these questions, so I'm grouping them together. And then Kai Wolf from the Sabre Conservation Fund, Conservation Alliance, had asked that there, specifically with the marine protected areas, how can they strengthen networks like the GCFI's MPA Connect that act as a platform for resource and expertise sharing through sharing that information through the Caribbean region. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on any of those questions about how we share information and build networks.
James, I'm happy to throw out here some thoughts. One of the initial ideas or the things that created the genesis, the idea to create this Congress, was that within the discussions of the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture, we noticed that there was a need to have discussions at the regional level, like the ones that we have had these last 3 days. And part of the impetus here and the way forward, I think, as well, is that within the nucleus of the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture, we can carry this conversation forward. I personally believe that this 3-day event should not be seen in a vacuum. I think every conversation that we have had for the last 3 days, we need to now take it forward. We need to take those ideas, those exchanges, and look at how those can influence the creation of new innovative financial mechanisms throughout the region. And that also includes the knowledge sharing aspect. It includes creating, those kinds of partnerships that are very much related to sharing within the region, but also with partners outside of the region. And I would like to see the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture being a crucial player in moving forward this whole process, and also serving as a repository of information and as a partner that can inform the region in these matters.
Thanks. I don't know, Danielle or Karolin, if you have any comments.
James, I saw that somebody also asked what was the Caribbean Challenge Initiative goal now, the target after the fact that, the 2020 goal has gone. And I want to just say that there is actually a discussion going on how the CCI could perhaps also play a role in the future and function as this umbrella platform. So this is why I want to mention it, because it plays a little bit also in the question that was related to the umbrella platform. I see Sibylle Reed-Miller is saying something about that so many privately protected areas exist around the world. That's great. I think that in the Caribbean, when I look at St. Lucia, for example, and for example, speaking now as a hotelier, if we wanted to protect our own reef or do our own conservation there, we would not be able by the legal framework, by law, to actually do what we would like to do. So I think in the Caribbean, it comes back again to maybe look at our legislative structure and how we can perhaps open the framework to allow for the private sector to play a bigger part. That's what I would have to offer to you, Sibylle. Thank you.
If I could jump quickly here, and I think there's someone in the chat, Marcia from the Nature Conservancy in the Bahamas. She's bringing up a very, very important point in terms of what needs to happen in the future. The CCI, in my view, was very successful up to 2020. And yes, there are some ideas going to the future, but the one single area where I definitely agree with Marcia is that effective management, we're still way behind in that area. And that's where I personally also believe is the strongest link with sustainable financing. That's where we see really the financial need in protected areas, both terrestrial and marine, for the effective management.
I think just want to jump here. Yeah, but I think one thing that I have been noticing, like I said, from the institutional investors' perspective, I think a lot of the focus for many years was like on the management of the risks. And there has been this trend, we've been seeing a lot of divestment from harmful activities, harmful sectors. But I think we are in a stage now, and I think the Sustainable Development Goals have really helped for that, where they are talking about double materiality. What can the financial sector has to contribute? What's the positive impact the financial sector can have as well as part of this role? So I think we need to think about that as well. Is look at this broader picture. The financial sector can play a role in adding value to the real world that we live in, and there is an interest in doing that. I think one challenge that we have been seeing, is that we see a lot of amazing projects all over around the world. But again, how can the financial sector to bring all this amazing effort that is already happening, bring that to scale? We need to create this dialogue. I saw a question here, between environmental sector and the financial sector to learning languages. Again, I don't think it's just the environmental sector and the financial sector. We need to bring everyone together to really find this common languages, common framework as well. So just to add to what you were saying, that I think it's really important to bring, because there is interest. There is interest from the financial sector to support this development, to change. It's going to be a risk for them as well in the long term. So I think it's the moment now, to try to create this language, to try to create this common framework, and to go there and to start talking to the financial sector more openly and educate them about what is being done, what is working, what is not working.
There's a few questions on this topic that I think it would be worth voicing, and then we'll have to ask the panel to wrap up. So I'll read these comments and maybe you can address them if we do 2 minutes each in final statements. So Karen Panton in Bahamas had said, would you say the environment sector and the finance sector have a responsibility to learn the instruments for financing biodiversity, and how could this meeting potentially engage the investors and banks more? So I think that's, I know CBF have already put a lot of thought into that question. I think it's an important one. Peter Edwards had asked, how can finance entities and governments support data collection on key ecosystem services, and how can that be verified? I think that's also an important one, although I'm not sure Peter will have time to address it. And Christopher Chinapu had asked, how can the momentum from the Congress start a wider coalition for action sharing and ongoing dialogue which kind of comes back to our networking question. So apologies if we don't get to touch on all of the questions and all of the comments submitted. There's a lot of great things coming through. But maybe we can go in the same order as we did the opening for just some final summary comments. So back to you, Danielle, if that's okay.
No, I think my three key messages is that we do take a holistic approach. Nature is nature. It's not climate, it's not biodiversity, it's not all separate. We need to think about it as a whole, it's a system. Work together. We need to have a lot of barriers, the language barrier that has been mentioned here, that is really important. And bring all voices. I think it's really important to bring all the voices from the ground as well to this discussion. We don't want unwanted consequences from our actions as well. So let's listen to the voice on the ground as well going forwards. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you, Danielle. I think the accessibility of this event with the French and Spanish interpretation, just one of the elements that really helps include that accessibility element. Karolin, your final comments?
I think that what Karen mentioned, how do you now, on what platform will you now connect with possible investors or bankers? It's a very, very good one. And I think that coming again from the tourism field, how often do we do presentations to travel advisors and we're using Zoom on one-on-one meetings? And I think that maybe there's an opportunity to actually send invitations to select representatives of various banks and investment firms and entities that would be suitable and create this virtual matchmaking platform and give our National Conservation Fund a chance to do a presentation. I think that would be, fantastic if that could happen. I think that my final words are just, I think that the communication is really critical right now. Educate and engage and just make sure that the awareness is there, that we exist. And I think that the more we educate, the more we communicate, we also inspire and perhaps inspire certain organizations that have not been engaged to come to the table. Thank you.
Yaba?
Thank you, James. Quickly on Peter Edwards' question, I think this is one of the hardest things to finance, data collection. I think very few donors and partners out there really focus on this, and it's something we need. It should not stop us from taking action, but definitely we need to find new ways of being able to finance these kinds of activities. And I think conservation trust funds can play a role. In terms of final words, and maybe also talking to some of the other questions in the chat box, I think the Caribbean region, when we go into the different tables out there, the financing table, tourism table, environment table, we are having a lot of separate conversations. Although we are seeing that those conversations are really interlinked, I feel that we still have some ways into creating a bigger table in which everybody comes together. And I hope that this Congress has been able to expand that table a little bit. I think in the future, this Congress could potentially do more. But again, I go back to what I mentioned before, that we need to stop our silo thinking, and we need to really build these financial mechanisms for nature, which really underpin everything that we human beings need, because the earth will continue to spin even if we are not around. So when we talk about conservation finance, climate finance, etc., we're really talking about us. Thank you.
Great chorus of agreements behind you as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was a really interesting panel to end what's been a really great few days on, thinking about the future, what's next, how do we keep momentum from this event. So thank you, Yabanex, Karolin, and Danielle for those great words. And I can see there's a lot more comments and conversation happening in the chat, so feel free to keep that conversation going if you do have further responses. We'll now go to the closing ceremony. And so I will hand over, Yabanex and Karolin will stay here, and I'll invite Eleanor Phillips from the Nature Conservancy to also join you. And with that, thank you everyone for a great discussion. Over to the closing. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, James. Now we are going to move to the final segment of this session and the closing of the overall Congress. We promise you all attending that we're going to be very brief. We know it has been a long week for everyone, but we really hope that you have enjoyed this journey through the Conservation Finance Congress, where we have really touched upon many topics related to conservation finance and sustainable financing in general for the Caribbean region. We probably didn't do justice to all the topics that we wanted to share with you, but we hope that we can come back with future editions of this event in next year, and perhaps even think about potentially doing a hybrid approach between a physical meeting and a virtual meeting. Before turning the floor to Eleanor and Karolin for the official closing remarks, we would like to also share with you a very short video that will bring you all memories of this journey that we have had during the last 3 days. Video, please.
The Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress created an opportunity to present creative, long-term financing solutions and resource mobilization scenarios for conservation and sustainable development for the Caribbean. The event promoted exchanges, strengthened networks, and highlighted the role of conservation trust funds in the region. Resource mobilization needs for islands to achieve the 2030 agenda were discussed. It was recognized that any sustainable financial architecture designed to support islands must have political leadership, strong private sector engagement, and a culturally appropriate approach. Participants agreed that to innovate in the establishment of financial mechanisms, it is necessary to demonstrate the value of the natural capital, align incentives, ensure policy coherence, create trust among stakeholders, ensure transparency, and invest in awareness. It is not only about generating more money. It is also about redirecting resources and focusing on behavior change. Conservations also focused on blue economy approaches that can be achieved by involving all stakeholders, measuring collectively the region's economic and ecological resources, scaling up successful best practices, and improving education and communication within governments as well as citizens. Coral reefs and mangroves were highlighted as the most cost-effective climate change adaptation allies to increase coastal resilience. Agile and robust financial mechanisms that take into account ocean risk and knowledge needs are key for the Caribbean to effectively adapt to climate change. The Congress brought together practical experiences from the field and members of the Caribbean sustainable finance architecture. Attendees discussed solutions, challenges, and lessons learned to build financial mechanisms and tackle financial needs for protected areas management, climate change adaptation, sustainable fisheries, and responsible tourism. Blended finance was singled out as a forward-looking financing solution for the Caribbean that can stimulate synergies between public and private sector resources flows. Thank you to all of you for attending this first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress, which we hope will contribute to the way forward for sustainable financing in the Caribbean.
Great, what a fantastic video featuring all the great sessions of the first Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. In my view, this video really captures all the important discussions over the past 3 years, with 9 sessions, including a wonderful working session over Remo, which I had a little bit of difficulty with, but I think most people got it, and a great field trip to St. Lucia. What a profound 3 days we've had. Good day to everyone. I am Eleanor Phillips, right now Vice Chair and Treasurer of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and Director of External Affairs for the Nature Conservancy's Caribbean Division. It is a great pleasure for me to deliver very brief closing remarks on behalf of the CBF. I would say that the past 3 days has me feeling so much more hopeful especially given all these dialogues with a core focus on financing nature and sharing innovative and creative ways to finance nature. I know many here share my passion for the Caribbean and for financing and securing our region's protected areas, which is essentially the base of all our region's livelihood. So with those brief remarks, I say thank you. Thank you to the audience, all the moderators, panelists who brought their views and experiences to this virtual table and created a space for rich discussions. I especially want to thank the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund for being such a great co-host for the event. The virtual field trip will be a lasting memory for this meeting, for me, and I'm sure as many of you as well, have we all yearning for that long overdue visit to St. Lucia. I want to thank you all for, I want to thank also the sponsors and partners of the event displayed on the screen. Without the support of these sponsors and partners, I think it's going to come up, we would have no Congress. So really thank German cooperation and the Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear Safety. We all know it as BMU. The German Development Bank, KfW, my employer, the Nature Conservancy, grateful to all the support that we've been able to bring. French Development Agency, AFD, the French GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and the French Global Environment Facility for FEM, Metzler Payden, the German Technical Cooperation Agency, or GIZ, Sustainable Marine Financing, and as well Island Innovation. We are really grateful for your support and your confidence in CBF and St. Lucia National Conservation Fund to launch this Congress, especially on a virtual platform. But most definitely, not least, I offer my huge personal thank you to the CBF Secretariat and its dedicated staff. You all are truly a joy to work with, and we all look in the next Caribbean Conservation Congress in person. So thank you. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Karolin Troubetzkoy, who is chair of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund and our chair for this Congress. Karolin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. So as the chairwoman of the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund, and on behalf of our CEO, Craig Henry, and our board of directors, let me thank everyone who attended the various panels and panel discussions over the past 3 days during our first time ever Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. For me, it was truly rewarding to see participants from all over the world. And we just commented even the Marshall Islands, it must be very early in the Marshall Islands, which only highlights the importance of the subject matter we discussed. And clearly the Caribbean is not alone in our quest to drive the conservation agenda forward and find sustainable mechanisms to do so. When looking back at these last few days, we here at the St. Lucia National Conservation Fund are encouraged and we are highly inspired by the discussions that took place, by the successes and best practices we shared, the challenges that we identified, but most importantly, I think we are encouraged by the many good recommendations that have been made to shift the needle and propel us forward. It is our hope that everyone that attended has taken home with them one great new idea that will allow them to formulate a new strategy or fine-tune their activities that they have been engaged with so far. We want to thank our speakers and moderators for having expertly guided us through the various sessions and stimulating lively discussions. I want to thank our CEO, Mr. Craig Henry, his team, and our affiliates for having worked so hard over the last few weeks to get ready for this event. We hope that everyone enjoyed the virtual field trip to St. Lucia and that it has tempted you to visit our St. Helen of the West soon. We would certainly enjoy showing you around here in St. Lucia. A very big thank you to the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund for co-hosting this event with us, especially Yabanex Batista, Karen Gale McDonald, but also all the other very important players at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, such as Andrea Montero, Damian Martinez, Joss Thing, Asha Gay Cowell, Junior Buchanan, Ulrike Kraus, Ibrahim Abdullah. And of course, there's also the tremendous Island Innovation team, whom we can't thank enough for having put this Congress together. James Ellsmoor, Christian Sakino, Alexandra Lemieux, Audrey Joachim, and Isabel Godoy. And then not to forget our excellent translators, Alexander Rijo, Alfredo Bassett, Thaina Corrington, Maria Coco, and Lydian Matos. Thank you again to everyone. And I now declare this inaugural Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress closed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.